Victor Hale believed humiliation was an art form, and tonight, beneath the crystal chandeliers of Manhattan's most prestigious charity chess gala, he was certain he had found his next masterpiece. The ballroom shimmered with polished marble, black tuxedos, diamond necklaces, and the low refined murmur of people who considered themselves intellectually superior simply because they could afford to sit in the front row. At the center of it all stood a raised walnut platform holding an oversized tournament chessboard, illuminated under white stage lights like an altar built for genius. Victor, 5-time national champion and the smug darling of elite chess circles, adjusted his silver cufflinks and smiled into the microphone as laughter rippled through the room. He had spent the evening dazzling wealthy donors with exhibition matches, crushing local masters in under 10 moves, feeding the crowd exactly what they had paid for: spectacle, ego, and the delicious reassurance that true brilliance only belonged to men like him. But arrogance is always most dangerous in the moments it feels safest. Near the far edge of the ballroom, almost blending into the cream-colored walls, stood Clara Bennett. 38 years old. Plain beige coat. Brown hair loosely pinned back. A canvas tote bag hanging from one shoulder. She looked less like a guest and more like someone who had wandered in from a public library by mistake. In truth, she had spent the last hour quietly arranging registration packets and collecting discarded event programs for the organizing staff, moving so unobtrusively that hardly anyone had looked at her twice. That was precisely why Martin Doyle noticed her. Martin, the evening's television host, loved improvising little moments of social theater to keep donors entertained, and as Victor wrapped up another easy victory, Martin stepped onto the stage with a grin sharpened by mischief. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice bouncing warmly across the ballroom, "our grandmaster has made this look a little too easy tonight. So how about we spice things up?" A few guests chuckled into their champagne flutes. Victor folded his arms, already amused. Martin scanned the room theatrically, pretending to search for courage among the audience before his eyes landed on Clara. "You there," he said, pointing directly at her. Heads turned in unison. Clara froze, one hand still holding a stack of folded brochures. "Yes, you, come join us. Let's see if our champion can teach a complete beginner how chess works." The laughter came faster this time, lighter, sharper, touched with the cruelty of expensive people who enjoyed safe humiliation because it never happened to them. Clara glanced behind her as if certain Martin meant someone else. "Me?" she asked softly. "Absolutely you," Martin said, leaning into the bit. "Unless there's a hidden grandmaster under that coat." More laughter. Victor smirked and leaned toward his microphone. "Don't worry," he added in a patronizing tone, "I promise not to use too many complicated words." Even the waitstaff near the side doors exchanged uneasy looks. Clara felt dozens of eyes pinning her in place, measuring her plain shoes, her inexpensive tote, the faint crease lines on her coat. For a second, she seemed ready to decline. Her fingers tightened around the brochures. Her cheeks warmed. The room sensed hesitation and enjoyed it. Martin raised an eyebrow. "Come on, folks, give her some encouragement." A wave of clapping rose, not kind clapping, but the kind reserved for someone being nudged toward a harmless public embarrassment. Clara lowered the brochures onto a nearby table. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag. Then, with a quiet inhale that no one heard except herself, she began walking toward the stage. Victor Hale watched her approach with the relaxed smile of a man certain he controlled every variable in the room. He had no idea that within minutes, the only sound left in that glittering ballroom would be the collapse of his own certainty. The moment Clara Bennett stepped onto the walnut platform, the contrast became almost theatrical. Victor Hale stood beneath the white lights in a tailored charcoal suit, every silver strand of hair arranged with deliberate precision, while Clara looked as if she had come straight from a cold evening commute, her beige coat modest, her low heels practical, her canvas tote now resting quietly against the side of the stage. A few guests in the front rows exchanged amused glances. Someone near the donor table whispered loudly enough to be heard, "This should be painful." Martin Doyle laughed into his microphone, feeding the mood with polished cruelty. "All right, Clara, have you played much chess?" Clara looked at the board, then at the audience, clearly aware that every eye in the ballroom was waiting for her to become the punchline. "A little," she answered. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, but Martin interpreted it as nervousness. "A little," he repeated with a grin. "Perfect. Then tonight you get a free lesson from one of the greatest minds in America." Applause fluttered across the room. Victor pulled out his chair with exaggerated courtesy. "Please," he said, gesturing for her to sit as if indulging a child. Clara took the seat without a word. She placed both hands lightly in her lap first, then slowly lifted her eyes to the board. It was a subtle shift, but something in her expression changed. The uncertainty everyone expected was not there. Instead, there was recognition. Familiarity. The quiet intimacy of someone looking at an old language she had once spoken fluently. Victor sat opposite her, still smiling for the cameras. "Do you know how the pieces move?" he asked, "or shall we begin with the basics?" More laughter. Clara folded her coat sleeves back from her wrists. "I know enough," she said. The answer was simple, but it landed with a strange firmness. Victor arched an eyebrow. Martin stepped aside, delighted by what he assumed would be several minutes of harmless embarrassment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our grandmaster has agreed to make this interesting. Miss Bennet only needs to survive 3 moves." A chorus of playful cheers rose from the ballroom. Several guests lifted their phones higher. Victor leaned toward Clara and lowered his voice, though the microphone clipped enough of it to carry. "Do not worry. I will go easy." Clara finally met his eyes. "You should not," she replied. It was such a soft sentence that many in the audience missed it, but Victor heard every word. For the first time that evening, his smile paused half a second too long. He reached forward and opened with a confident king-pawn advance, the kind of classic commanding move used by players who wanted immediate control and immediate intimidation. A few chess enthusiasts in the room nodded approvingly. Clara looked down, her fingers hovering over the white pieces. There was no fumbling. No hesitation of a beginner trying to remember rules. She touched one pawn, then another, as if feeling the balance of the position rather than searching for options. Then she made her move. Quietly. Cleanly. Instantly. Victor glanced down, still unconcerned, but one of the younger guests in the second row tilted his head. "That is not random," he murmured to his companion. Martin continued smiling, unaware of the tiny current beginning to shift beneath the ballroom's polished surface. Victor responded with a night development, casual and theatrical, even tossing a joke over his shoulder to the audience. "See? She is surviving already." The crowd laughed obediently. Clara did not. She made her second move in less than 2 seconds. This time Victor's hand stopped before touching his next piece. His eyes narrowed, just slightly. It was not fear. Not yet. But it was the first crack in the smooth glass of his certainty. Across the room, the laughter thinned by a noticeable degree. People who had been watching for comedy now leaned forward for a different reason. Clara Bennet sat perfectly still, her gaze on the board, while Victor Hale looked down at the position and realized, with a small unwelcome tightening in his chest, that this simple woman was not playing to survive 3 moves at all. Victor Hale told himself it was a coincidence, nothing more than a lucky sequence from an overconfident amateur, yet his fingertips no longer moved with the lazy swagger they had carried through every exhibition match that evening. He studied the board again. Clara's opening was disciplined, measured, and deeply positional, the kind of structure that did not come from memorizing a few casual games online. It came from study. Years of it. Victor shifted in his chair and made his third move with more force than necessary, sliding his bishop into what should have been a controlling diagonal. He even glanced toward Martin Doyle, expecting the host to keep the crowd laughing, but Martin sensed the change in atmosphere and hesitated. The jokes were beginning to feel premature. Clara responded almost immediately, her slender fingers placing a knight with surgical calm. A man near the front donor table leaned toward his wife. She just cut off his king side. The wife blinked. What does that mean? He did not answer because Victor himself was now staring at the exact same thing. The path he had intended was gone. Not blocked by accident. Closed deliberately. He lifted his eyes to Clara for a fraction of a second, searching her face for some hint of bluff, some trace of panic, some nervous satisfaction. He found none. She sat exactly as she had before, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, breathing even. It was the composure that unsettled him more than the moves. Beginners looked around for approval. Pretenders smiled when they landed something clever. Clara did neither. She behaved like someone handling routine business. Victor cleared his throat and offered a brittle chuckle to the audience. Well, he said, our volunteer has clearly watched a few tutorials. A few scattered laughs answered him, thin and uncertain. Nobody was fully laughing now. The ballroom that had been buoyant 10 minutes earlier had begun sinking into attentive silence. Waiters paused beside linen-covered tables. Guests lowered champagne glasses without drinking. Even the camera crew tightened their shots, no longer filming a novelty but a shift. Victor pushed a pawn, trying to create pressure in the center, but there was a faint stiffness in the motion. Clara looked once, then slid her queen into a square so natural and yet so suffocating that Victor's stomach tightened before his mind fully caught up. He blinked. Looked again. Every aggressive line he had prepared had narrowed. Every comfortable attack lane was being redirected. This was not a woman trying not to lose. This was a player building a cage. Martin Doyle stepped closer to the board, no microphone banter this time, his polished television smile slowly fading into genuine confusion. Interesting, he murmured, forgetting to project. Victor heard it and felt irritation spark. He was Victor Hale. He had humiliated state champions on live television. He had written books. He had spent 3 decades making rooms admire him. He would not become the evening's entertainment because of a woman in a beige coat. Determined to reclaim authority, he moved faster than he should have, snapping his rook into an active file with theatrical confidence. It was meant to signal control. Clara studied the board for the longest time yet, perhaps for seconds. Then she made one quiet bishop move. Nothing dramatic. No flourish. Just wood against polished wood. Yet the effect was immediate. Victor's eyes widened. He leaned closer. His rook was trapped. Not captured yet, but trapped 2 moves ahead unless he dismantled his own center. A younger chess patron near the back actually whispered, "Oh my God." That whisper carried farther than intended because the room had become so still. Victor felt warmth gather under his collar. For the first time all night, he loosened his tie with one finger. Clara finally looked up at him, not smugly, not cruelly, simply with the level gaze of someone waiting for him to see what she had already seen minutes ago. And in that suspended white light, with 200 wealthy strangers holding their breath, Victor Hale understood a deeply uncomfortable truth. He was no longer performing a lesson. He was being led into one. There is a peculiar sound that fills an elegant room when superiority begins to crack. It is not loud. It is the absence of everything that was loud a moment before. No more clinking crystal. No more whispered jokes. No more indulgent laughter from people convinced they were witnessing harmless amusement. That silence had started to spread now, table by table, row by row, as Victor Hale stared at the board and realized every comfortable instinct he relied on had become a liability. He shifted his trap rook backward, a defensive concession so subtle that casual observers missed its significance, but the serious players in attendance did not. One elderly investor who sponsored collegiate chess scholarships slowly removed his glasses and leaned forward. "He is retreating," he murmured. Beside him, a woman in emerald silk blinked in disbelief. Victor Hale did not retreat. That was his brand. Yet here he was, giving ground to a woman whom everyone in this room had laughed at less than 5 minutes ago. Victor forced a smile toward the audience, but it looked strained, stretched too thin over the tightening lines of his face. "Not bad," he said, as though grading a student. "You have instincts." Clara Bennett said nothing. She did not need the compliment, and somehow that made it feel smaller than the polished cufflinks on Victor's wrist. She studied the board with a concentration so complete that the ballroom itself seemed to disappear around her. Then she moved a pawn one square. Such an ordinary gesture. Such an ordinary piece. Yet Victor inhaled sharply through his nose because he saw it immediately. The pawn was poison. If he ignored it, she would lock his bishop. If he took it, his king's side would fracture. 3 options flashed through his mind. All of them ugly. Martin Doyle, standing only a few feet away, glanced from Clara to Victor and back again, his television instinct screaming that something far more compelling than a staged joke was unfolding. He lowered his microphone. Nobody wanted commentary now. They wanted answers. Victor selected the least damaging line and advanced his knight, trying to create counterplay, but his hand no longer landed pieces with flair. It landed them with calculation. Clara answered in less than 2 seconds. Queen to a narrow interior square. Victor froze. The move looked almost modest, but its implications rolled across the board like a door quietly clicking shut. His knight had no useful future. His bishop remained compressed. His rook still lacked freedom. Every route toward initiative dissolved into reactive survival. A young man filming on his phone whispered, "She is squeezing him." The phrase spread in low breaths because it was the perfect description. Clara was not attacking with fireworks. She was removing oxygen. Victor leaned back for the first time. Buying himself 3 seconds to think, but the bright stage lights now felt hot against his temples. He loosened his jaw. He could feel 200 eyes measuring every pause. Earlier that evening those eyes had fed him. Admiration was a familiar fuel. But scrutiny under vulnerability was something else entirely. He looked at Clara again, harder this time. Beige coat. Plain blouse. No jewelry except a simple watch. No expression of triumph. Nothing about her matched the humiliating lesson now unfolding beneath his own fingertips. "Where did you learn to play?" he asked, trying to make the question sound casual. Clara adjusted one sleeve and kept her gaze on the board. "A long time ago," she said. The answer was maddeningly thin. Victor wanted context. He wanted credentials. He wanted some visible explanation he could package and dismiss. Instead he got mystery, and mystery is unbearable to arrogant men because it means they cannot control the narrative. He pushed another pawn, this time not because it was strong but because he needed motion, needed to prove to himself and everyone watching that he was still directing the game. Clara responded with a bishop slide so quiet that the wooden click sounded almost delicate. Then Victor saw it. Not just the immediate threat. The pattern. For moves from now his king would be boxed into a corridor with no active escape unless he sacrificed major material. His throat tightened. He looked up instinctively, perhaps hoping Martin would laugh, perhaps hoping someone would interrupt, perhaps hoping the ballroom would return to being a ballroom instead of a courtroom. But all he saw were motionless faces and raised phones and the unnerving stillness of wealthy spectators witnessing the slow public dismantling of a man they had come to admire. And for the first time that night, Victor Hale felt something colder than embarrassment. He felt the creeping suspicion that Clara Bennett had seen the ending of this game long before he understood he was in danger. Victor Hale had built an entire career on making difficult positions look elegant, but there was nothing elegant about the board in front of him now. It had become narrow, airless, and strangely unfamiliar, as though the 64 squares he had ruled for 30 years had quietly changed shape beneath Clara Bennett's hands. He leaned forward, elbows near the table, no longer posing for cameras, no longer aware of the polished audience surrounding him in silk gowns and black tuxedos. The gala had dissolved. The donors had dissolved. Even Martin Doyle, usually incapable of silence for more than 3 seconds, stood frozen at the edge of the platform with the microphone lowered against his chest. Victor saw only lines, diagonals, trapped files, and one unbearable fact: every natural attacking instinct he reached for had already been anticipated. He pushed his queen outward in a desperate attempt to create pressure against Clara's exposed flank, a move flashy enough that a few non-players inhaled hopefully, thinking perhaps the champion had found his footing again. But the hope lasted less than a heartbeat. Clara touched her knight, rotated it once between two fingers, and placed it down with the soft certainty of someone closing a lock. Victor's queen had space, yes, but no purpose. Worse, his own king now sat behind a thinning wall of pieces that looked protective only from a distance. Up close, the geometry was collapsing. Victor swallowed. There was a faint sheen beginning at his temples, tiny beads of moisture catching the white stage lights. He heard someone in the second row whisper, "Why is he thinking so long?" Another voice answered, "Because she has him." Those four words struck harder than any applause he had enjoyed all evening. She has him. Victor Hale, the man who sold confidence as entertainment, was now being described like prey in his own exhibition. He straightened suddenly and forced a laugh that fooled no one. "You are full of surprises, Miss Bennet." Clara finally looked at him. Her eyes were not triumphant. That somehow made the moment heavier. Triumphant eyes would have been a contest. Calm eyes made it feel inevitable. "Only to people who do not pay attention," she said. A murmur moved through the ballroom. The line was polite, almost gentle, but it landed with the precision of a needle. Victor's jaw flexed. He dropped his gaze back to the board and calculated furiously. If he exchanged bishops, he lost initiative. If he preserved material, he surrendered central control. If he tried to force complications, his king's side opened into a tactical nightmare. There was still no immediate checkmate, which made it worse. Clara was not ending him with drama. She was escorting him toward a position where every remaining move would be his own public confession that he had been outclassed. He made the bishop exchange anyway, hoping simplification might reduce the pressure. Clara recaptured instantly. Then came another move from her rook, sliding into an open file Victor had overlooked because he had been too busy searching for active threats. The sound of the rook touching wood echoed with absurd clarity. Victor stared. His left hand rose unconsciously to loosen his collar. That rook now cut his board in half. His king had one narrow corridor. His knight was pinned into passivity. His queen, though technically mobile, had no clean route back to defend. He looked at Clara, really looked at her now, as though stripping away the beige coat and canvas tote might reveal the explanation he desperately needed. "Have we met before?" he asked, unable to stop himself. Martin Doyle blinked. Several guests exchanged confused glances. It was not the question of a champion controlling a novelty match. It was the question of a man searching memory for a missed warning. Clara lowered her hands into her lap again. "You used to say people reveal themselves by how they open," she answered quietly. Victor's face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for Martin to notice. Enough for the front row to notice. Enough for the room to sense that whatever was happening on this board had just become larger than a clever stranger embarrassing a grandmaster. Victor looked back down at the pieces, but now he was no longer just calculating moves. He was calculating history, trying to drag a forgotten name from the dusty corners of his own ambition, while Clara Bennet sat across from him with the unshakable stillness of someone who had not come to win a game, but to finish an old unfinished sentence. Victor Hale heard the sentence and felt something shift loose inside his memory, not all at once, but in fragments. A crowded training hall in Connecticut. Rows of young competitors hunched over boards. A scholarship clinic he had hosted nearly 12 years earlier when cameras still followed him everywhere and every public appearance was another chance to cultivate the legend of Victor Hale, mentor of champions. He used to stroll between tables dispensing opinions with the confidence of a man who believed his instincts were law. One opening. One glance at posture. 1 minute watching a child or amateur touch the pieces, and he would pronounce whether they had promise. He had repeated the line to journalists so often it became one of his signatures. People reveal themselves by how they open. At the time it sounded profound. In reality, it was arrogance disguised as wisdom. Victor's fingers hovered above his queen now, but his eyes were no longer seeing Manhattan. They were seeing a much smaller room with folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and a skinny woman in a thrift store sweater standing beside board 17. She had been younger then, maybe mid-20s, with the same steady eyes and the same irritatingly quiet posture. He remembered because she had not fit the room's usual social pattern. Most scholarship hopefuls arrived with coaches, branded chess bags, eager parents. She had arrived alone carrying a worn canvas satchel. He had stopped at her board only briefly. She was playing a closed positional opening against one of his sponsored juniors. Victor remembered glancing down, seeing the modest first moves, and dismissing her instantly. Too cautious, he had thought. Too plain. No killer instinct. He had not even waited to see the middle game. Conservative openings rarely produce elite players, he had said to the event coordinator with a shrug. The coordinator had nodded and marked her file. Scholarship funding went elsewhere that year. Victor blinked hard. The ballroom returned in pieces. White lights. Silent guests. Clara Bennett across from him. Older now, but unmistakable. His mouth opened slightly. Board 17, he said before he could stop himself. Clara's expression did not change, but there was the faintest lowering of her eyes, as though acknowledging that at last he had reached the same page she had been reading from all evening. Martin Doyle looked from one to the other, baffled and riveted. "You know each other?" he asked, but nobody answered him. Victor's chest tightened with a discomfort far more corrosive than losing. Losing could be explained by tactics, by one bad line, by a brilliant opponent. This was different. This was the realization that years earlier he had not merely overlooked talent. He had participated in burying it because it arrived wearing the wrong clothes and carrying the wrong kind of bag. "You were at the Fairfield Scholarship Invitational," Victor said, his voice quieter now. Clara moved one pawn forward, another almost invisible tightening move that made his king's future even smaller. "I was," she replied. Around them, guests listened with the unnerving stillness of people sensing confession in progress. Victor remembered more. After the scholarship rejection, he had never thought about board 17 again. Why would he? His life had continued through television interviews, book tours, luxury endorsements, first-class flights, donor galas exactly like this one. Meanwhile, the woman he had dismissed had disappeared into the anonymous category where arrogant men place all the people they choose not to see. Yet here she was, not asking for apology, not announcing grievance, simply letting the board speak in the language he respected most because it was the only language he had never believed could be turned against him. Victor made his next move almost mechanically, sliding his king into the narrow corridor still available. Clara answered with her rook. The file closed. A visible murmur swept the serious players in attendance. One donor actually whispered, "He is nearly boxed in." Victor no longer cared who heard. He stared at the position and then at Clara. "Why now?" he asked. It was not a strategic question. It was the question of a man who suddenly understood that this match had not been an accident, that the beige coat, the silence, the willingness to walk onto this stage under ridicule had all carried the weight of intention. Clara folded her hands once more, her voice low enough that the room leaned in to catch it. Because some lessons only matter when they are finally public. And Victor Hale, national champion, celebrated lecturer, master of elegant humiliations, felt the final warmth drain from his confidence as he realized he was no longer trying to save a chess game. He was trying to survive the exposure of the man he had always been. The board had become a confession table, and every piece Victor Hale touched now seemed to accuse him of something larger than miscalculation. He sat under the white stage lights with his shoulders no longer squared for performance but subtly curved inward, the posture of a man beginning to understand that prestige offers no shelter when truth arrives in a language everyone can witness. Around the ballroom, phones remained raised, though nobody was smiling for social clips anymore. This was not gala entertainment. This was a dismantling. Martin Doyle glanced toward the production crew as if waiting for someone to cut to commercial, but there was no television script for this kind of silence. Clara Bennett rested her fingertips lightly beside the board, neither rushing him nor rescuing him. That was the cruel mercy of superior control. She allowed him all the time in the world to see what he had done to himself. Victor examined the position again. His king had one narrow escape square. His queen was stranded too far from meaningful defense. His knight remained pinned by Clara's bishop, and her rook dominated the open file like a steel gate. There were technical resources, yes, but all of them required concessions that would look ugly, desperate, visibly inferior. For a man who had built his identity on elegance, desperation felt worse than defeat. He moved his queen back at last, an admission of defensive necessity so plain that several experienced players in attendance exhaled at once. Clara responded immediately with another tightening pawn push. No theatrics. No flourish. Just one more inch of pressure. Victor stared at it and gave a faint disbelieving shake of his head. You could have said who you were, he muttered. The microphone on the table caught enough of it to carry through the front rows. Clara's eyes lifted. Would you have listened? She asked. The question landed harder than any tactical blow because Victor already knew the answer. 12 years ago he had not listened. Tonight, when Martin pointed at the plain woman near the wall and the room laughed, Victor had not listened again. He had seen clothing, posture, social cues, and from those fragments he had written an entire story in which he remained superior. The realization settled over him with humiliating clarity: this match was not exposing one bad judgment. It was exposing a lifelong habit of judgments. Victor inhaled slowly and looked around for the first time since the game had turned. Faces stared back at him, not with admiration now, but with clinical fascination. Donors. Journalists. Sponsors. Wealthy patrons who had quoted his books and funded his clinics. He saw in their eyes the subtle but unmistakable shift from spectator to evaluator. He was being assessed. Measured. Perhaps for the first time, found emotionally small. Martin Doyle swallowed and whispered, though everyone still heard it, "Victor," but Victor did not answer. He slid his king into the only legal square left. A tiny movement. A surrender of geometry. Clara's hand moved toward her queen, then paused. Instead she chose her bishop, placing it on a diagonal that looked innocent for half a second until Victor's entire face drained. The trap was complete. His rook could not interpose effectively. His knight could not move. His queen had one futile checking line that delayed but did not alter the outcome. He saw the sequence all at once, the way masters do when there is no longer any room for denial. 3 moves. At most. Martin Doyle leaned over the table, eyes darting between pieces. Is that, he did not finish because an elderly chess sponsor in the front row answered in a whisper that somehow carried to the chandeliers. Yes. She has forced him. Forced him. The phrase rolled through Victor's mind like a sentence from a judge. He looked up at Clara, searching for anger. Vindication, anything personal enough that he could reduce this to a private grudge. But Clara's face remained composed, almost sorrowfully composed, and that made the room feel colder. She was not punishing him out of spite. She was demonstrating consequence. Victor attempted the futile queen check anyway because champions cling to motion when dignity is slipping, but Clara neutralized it in one clean move, as though brushing aside dust. Another collective breath left the ballroom. Victor's lips parted, then closed. His hands rested on the table, suddenly older than they had looked an hour ago. He understood now that the end was no longer theoretical. It was visible to everyone except those who did not know chess, and even they could read the mathematics of his face. Clara Bennett studied him for one final second, then gently reached for the piece that would turn quiet domination into irreversible public fact. Clara Bennett lifted her queen with the same calm precision she had shown from the first move, and when she placed it down, the sound of polished wood touching walnut seemed louder than the ballroom's chandeliers, louder than the city traffic 30 floors below, louder than every smug laugh that had filled this room 10 minutes earlier. Victor Hale looked at the square, then at the bishop guarding the diagonal, then at the rook sealing the file, and finally at his king boxed into a corner of his own making. There was no tactical miracle. No elegant escape. No hidden resource waiting to redeem him. The sequence was mathematically final, brutally simple in the way only true mastery can be. Clara folded her hands in her lap and spoke 2 words. Checkmate, Victor. Not Mr. Hale. Not grandmaster. Victor. The familiarity of it struck as deeply as the move itself. For several seconds, nobody reacted. There was no applause because applause belonged to performances, and this no longer felt like one. It felt like a verdict. Martin Doyle stood motionless, microphone hanging uselessly at his side, his polished host persona completely gone. A waiter near the back had stopped in mid-step with a tray of untouched glasses. 2 women at the donor table stared with parted lips. Phones remained lifted, but even the people filming seemed to forget to breathe. The room had become a vacuum of stunned comprehension. Victor did not touch a piece. He did not challenge the line. He did not ask for clarification because he knew better than anyone in this room that the position was over. His king had no legal square. His defenders were frozen. His options had ended several moves ago, only his denial had remained. Slowly, almost mechanically, he leaned back in his chair. The white lights exposed every detail now, the shine of sweat at his temples, the stiffness in his jaw, the hollowness behind eyes that had spent a lifetime expecting admiration as a natural climate. Clara watched him without hostility. That somehow made the silence heavier. Hostility would have given him an enemy. Her composure left him alone with consequence. Victor swallowed once. You planned this, he said, but the accusation lacked force. It sounded less like anger and more like a man arriving late to an obvious conclusion. Clara glanced at the board. No, she said quietly. You planned this years ago. I only accepted the invitation. A visible ripple moved through the front rows. Some guests frowned, piecing together the implication. Others looked at Victor with a new kind of curiosity, not the admiration reserved for celebrated intellect, but the colder curiosity reserved for moral failure revealed in public. Victor lowered his eyes. Board 17. Fairfield. The careless comment. The scholarship file. A young woman dismissed because her opening looked too conservative and her appearance did not fit the glossy mythology he liked to reward. How many times had he done versions of that to others? How many careers had he categorized in seconds because arrogance had convinced him his first glance was insight? Tonight the arithmetic had returned with interest. Martin Doyle finally found his voice, but it came out thin. Clara, are you saying he kept you from that scholarship? Clara did not look at Martin. I am saying some doors are closed by people who never bother learning whom they shut out. No one moved. No one laughed. Victor's lips parted as if searching for a defense, but what defense exists when the board itself has become evidence? He could explain probabilities. He could explain event criteria. He could explain that he did not personally control every final decision. Yet none of those explanations could erase the deeper ugliness now visible to everyone watching. He had looked at someone humble and decided she was small before her talent had even spoken. And now, under crystal chandeliers, in front of donors, journalists, cameras, and the same elite audience that had once enjoyed his effortless humiliations, he had been measured by that exact blindness. Clara rose from her chair. The scrape of wood against the stage floor sounded startling in the stillness. She picked up her beige coat, lifted the familiar canvas tote from beside the table, and for one suspended second stood over the defeated board while Victor Hale remained seated before his checkmated king like a monument to collapse certainty. Then Clara leaned slightly closer, her voice low, clear, and impossible for the front rows to miss. The strongest players do not need a crowd to feel tall. Victor closed his eyes. And the room stayed silent. Clara Bennett turned and stepped away from the walnut platform with no trace of triumph in her posture, and that absence of celebration made her victory feel infinitely larger. She did not raise a hand to acknowledge the crowd. She did not pause for cameras. She did not offer the room the dramatic satisfaction of watching a humble champion beg for explanation. She simply lifted her canvas tote onto her shoulder and walked toward the side aisle the same way she had walked toward the stage minutes earlier, quietly, steadily, as if public judgment had never once altered her rhythm. Yet behind her, everything had altered. Martin Doyle remained rooted beside the chessboard, staring at Victor Hale, then at Clara's retreating figure, then back at the checkmated position as though hoping television instinct might tell him how to narrate something that had already said too much for words. It did not. The microphones were still live, but nobody spoke. Around the ballroom, guests slowly lowered their phones. Some looked embarrassed now, remembering their own laughter when Clara had first been singled out near the wall. A woman in pearls glanced down into her untouched champagne and exhaled. One of the younger donors quietly set his recording phone face down on the linen tablecloth, as if even keeping the footage felt invasive. Because what they had witnessed was not merely a chess upset. It was the public collapse of a social assumption they had all participated in without noticing. Victor Hale still sat before the board. His king remained stranded in the corner, small and useless beneath Clara's queen. He stared at it with the fixed gaze of a man replaying years rather than moves. In the sterile brightness of the stage lights, he no longer looked like a celebrated champion hosting an elite charity exhibition. He looked like what arrogance always looks like when stripped of applause, ordinary, aging, and deeply unsure of itself. He heard Clara's heels fading softly across the marble floor, and something inside him urged him to call after her, to say her name, to offer apology, context, explanation, anything that might stitch a thread between this suffocating moment and some more manageable version of reality. But apology offered only after exposure is rarely mistaken for character. It is usually recognized as panic. So Victor said nothing. His silence was the first honest thing he had contributed all evening. Clara reached the ballroom doors just as one of the event coordinators moved instinctively to open them for her. The woman did so with an expression completely different from the dismissive glances Clara had received earlier while collecting programs. There was respect in it now, but Clara did not linger to receive that either. Respect given only after proof had never interested her much. She passed through the doorway and disappeared into the Manhattan night beyond the glass lobby, swallowed by reflections of taxis, winter lights, and the anonymous flow of people who would never know that 30 floors above them an entire room of privilege had just been taught a lesson in perception. Back inside, Martin finally cleared his throat, but his usual polished humor was gone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, then stopped because there was no light-hearted transition possible after moral exposure. He lowered the microphone again. Victor rose slowly from his chair. The movement drew every eye, yet no one clapped, no one rushed to comfort him, no one offered the social rescue that status often purchases. Why? Because every person in that ballroom understood, whether they knew chess or not, that the real checkmate had not happened on 6-4 squares. It had happened in the invisible space between assumption and truth. Victor looked toward the closed doors where Clara had vanished and then down once more at his defeated king. For decades he had believed intelligence announced itself in Polish, pedigree,